This is Dan Schneider, and in this interview, I'll be talking with two men who watch soaps along with myself. We'll be talking about men who do watch soaps, why we watch soaps, and we'll be talking specifically about a soap opera that all three of us have watched for probably decades, and that is General Hospital on the ABC television network, and we'll do that in just a moment. So this is Dan Schneider, and I'm back with two male soap fans. The names are Brian and Dave. And anyone who has looked at my website has seen a few times that I've written on soap operas. And I myself have been a longtime watcher of not only soap operas, but serial fiction going back to the old movie serials of the 1930s with my dad when I was a kid. So let's talk a little bit about how all three of us got into it, and I'll start off with Brian. Brian, first, if you'd want to just say a little bit of background of yourself, like your age and what you do for a living, and then what soaps that you first started watching and how that evolved. So, Brian.
Good morning. Sure. My name is Brian. I am 48 years old, and I started watching. Actually, I work in banking, and I started watching soaps back in the mid 70s when I was a little kid with my sister, and specifically that was All My Children. And then about probably 5 years later, she had to get a job. So this is before the days of having a VCR and whatnot. So she asked if I would stay home and watch for her. And so I watched all three ABC shows at the time, All My Children, One Life to Live, and General Hospital. And I'd give her an update when she got home from work, and that was how I got started.
Was that when they were all half-hour soaps?
No, this was actually All My Children. I started in 1975. I started watching all three of them in 1980.
Oh, okay. But All My Children, that was an hour when you first started watching? I thought they were half hours
I
back in
think
the
when I
60s.
first started watching All My Children, it was 45 minutes.
Oh yeah, okay, that's right, 45. How about you, Dave? What's your story?
Well, hello, I'm Dave. I guess the first stuff I watched was Soap itself on ABC around '77.
Oh yeah, Billy
I
Crystal,
had
yeah.
I hadn't watched any soaps before that, but I thought it was hilarious. Then I was growing up in a neighborhood where all the kids were older than me, and I had an older brother who was their friends, and everybody was watching GH back then. It was the Luke and Laura on the Run, Summer on the Run thing, and Scotty and Laura. And so I started watching with them, with my brother primarily. Actually, kind of found it pretty boring. And then tried different shows. I watched Young and Restless for about, I don't know, 3 months, Days for about 6 months, and then just wound up back with GH because my brother was watching it. And this is probably around August of '81 that I started watching regularly. And his girlfriend watched it, and all the friends in the neighborhood watched it. So we watched together and talked about it. I remember in junior high, all the guys were, guys and girls, were all watching the show. So, but it was always kind of like a secret, like an embarrassment thing. The guys would admit it, but it was like, oh well, sort of thing. But I've been watching on and off since then.
Yeah, just so people know, and if someone listens to this years from now when they're all off the air, when you said Days, you mean Days of Our Lives, which was
Yeah.
a popular soap opera, just so people know. I know myself, I'm 50, and I started, well, let's see, depending on when we can talk a little bit about what you define a soap opera. I mentioned serial movies like the old Buck Rogers serials that I watched with my dad in the early 70s. Then there was Doctor Who, and so I watched that with Tom Baker, which was I always think was the best stuff. But as far as actual soap operas, I think it was in 1977 or 78. A friend of mine wanted me to watch. I think it was Days of Our Lives with the Marlena character. I forget the famous actress, who well-known soap actress. What's her name?
Deidre Hall.
Deidre Hall, right? And I just found it boring. And so I guess maybe it was about, I might have watched a week or two, and then about maybe 6 months, a year later, my sister and her friend, I was grew up in Queens, New York, and all my friends were away at summer camps and whatnot. We didn't have the money, so I was home. My sister and her friend said, "Why don't you watch, Hospital 78-ish or so?" And that's when the character of Luke Spencer, played by Anthony Geary, first came on. And I watched on and off here and there. I watched, I guess, a little bit of All My Children. It wasn't until about 1980, maybe the spring, that I started watching steadily. I did, however, start watching one soap steadily, religiously for about 2 years, and it's still, as long as I watched General Hospital, my all-time favorite soap came from Australia, and it was called Prisoner Cell Block H. It was about women in prison. A terrific show, and I actually have DVDs of like two of their best of episodes, although it's kind of silly. Episode 527, and then the next episode is 712. But that was my favorite soap. Gorgeous Australian babes in prison. And,
I think I remember that actually.
Yeah, if you ever find the DVDs on Amazon or at a half price books or used CD DVD place, for $4 or $5, just pick it up, because it's really funny, and quite good. But anyway, then I got into General Hospital and I watched that, and over the years I watched only basically the ABC soaps, and for a little bit, I guess, in the early 90s, All My Children was a lot better than General Hospital, so I made a point to always watch that. But then, now that you only have General Hospital left. But anyway, let's move on and talk about, a little bit about sort of the kind of stigma. And I don't know if it's really a stigma nowadays, because ABC soaps and General Hospital weren't just at least after I started watching, it wasn't the weepy, disease of the month kind of thing where everyone's wringing their hands and just having affairs. Although that's a part of soap operas, this was the era when the high adventures in General Hospital started. So was that one of the things that drew both of you, Dave and Brian?
Definitely. Like I said, I started with All My Children.
Yeah.
That was intermittent, and like you, I didn't start watching religiously until 1980. And as soon as they went on the run the first time, I was hooked.
Yeah.
And that's really what did it for me. So the one summer with Being on the Run, and the next summer with the whole Ice Princess, I was really hooked. It was my favorite show.
And was GH, General Hospital, your prime soap, and All My Children or One Life to Live or Ryan's Hope, whatever was on at the time, were they ancillary ones that you watched, or was it basically just General Hospital?
It was All My Children and General Hospital for a very long time.
Yeah.
One Life to Live was kind of like the filler between that I had to get through.
Dave?
And well, actually, I didn't say it before, but we're all the same age. I'm about 48 too. I'm sorry, Dan. What was the question? What was the question again? I drew a blank.
Oh, was General Hospital sort of your primary soap opera, and did you watch any others?
I think it was about stigma also.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Like I was saying before, is when I was watching the show, when I first started watching the show around 80, 81, and there was a lot of guys watching it too, so it was not sort of that out there, although it was never like cool, but it wasn't like a shameful thing necessarily either. I think that kind of came on a little bit later. Soaps had a real bad rep of housewives sitting around a coffee table, talking forever, that sort of thing, and the weepy scenes. And GH was kind of different. I was never really a big fan of the action stories. I didn't like Ice Princess, which is kind of what was going on when I first started. But
just so people know, the Ice Princess was a story about this mad Greek tycoon that wanted to free people, basically. So it was a James Bondy.
To put it nicely, yes, it was. It was, for me, it was like totally over the top story.
Yeah.
And which is fine, but I was more drawn to kind of like the crazy characters. I liked Heather Weber. She really drew me in.
Yeah.
The whole Weber family, actually, I thought was pretty cool. I liked Scotty also. Doing all the bad things. So it was always the doers on the show, the people who made things move, who were kind of bad but likable, still bad. That kind of got me going.
Yeah,
also.
in its prime, the thing about General Hospital, it sometimes ran 3, 4 stories deep. And I know in the early 80s, for me, probably the best period is 79 to maybe 85, a 5 or 6 year period. That's not to say it hasn't had good periods since, but those were from the Left-Handed Boy, which was the introduction of the sort of white bread mafia into Port Charles, which is the fictional city General Hospital is set in, until they did a story called The Aztec Princess, which was about this surprisingly Northern European descendant of Mexico, this gorgeous blonde little girl who was supposedly an Aztec, but they did about a half a dozen really big long stories that were really good. My favorite was another James Bondian type story called the Prometheus Disc, which was about some scientist who was working on a device that would give like infinite fuel, an infinite fuel
Power.
supply. Yeah, and to me that was the best story because it was like a tsunami that picked up all the little stories around it, and you had 7 or 8 stories ending up culminating in this one big story. And to me, it was just a masterpiece of storytelling. Not that other stories haven't been good or whatnot, but you had the supposed death of Luke. You had the guy who became the star of the show in the 80s, Robert Scorpio, and Emma Sams's character, Holly. You had their love story. You had Luke's recovery from injury. It ended up also bringing Laura, the character of Laura Weber, back onto the canvas, or Laura Spencer. It introduced the Cold War, the DVX, and the which was, I don't think that ever stood for anything, and the World Security Bureau, the WSB, became that story. You had a the main character in that story was played by a guy from the old Eight Is Enough comedy show on ABC, Brian Patrick Clark, who played a spy who was actually a lookalike for what turned out to be later a serial killer. So it had all of these interesting stories that came up, and you had these minor characters, and that was the thing that drew me about the General Hospital and soap operas in general. All My Children was throughout most of the 80s, also had a lot of good stories like that as well. Brian, how about you? Were you more drawn to individual characters or to the stories themselves?
A little bit of both, actually. And what you just described, it was a good trigger for my memory because I never realized that every time people talk on the boards about the Prometheus disc, I actually did see all of that. I
Yeah.
thought it was something that happened while I was in college and missed a couple of years.
Yeah.
But no, I really enjoyed the On the Run and then the Ice Princess, and now what I understand to be the Prometheus disc. I was very enthralled with Tristan Rogers as Robert Scorpio, the whole, secret panels in the condo thing, and any kind of James Bond stuff I really got into. So I really enjoyed that. But then I also really loved Laura and Holly and several characters. And Dave, you mentioned Heather Weber. I absolutely loved her.
I
So
love Heather.
what's that?
Oh, I love Heather.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Robin Matson version.
Yeah, every time Robin Matson comes back, I'm very happy.
Yeah. And just so people know, when you mentioned the boards, you were meaning IMDb, Internet Movie Database, which is as we record here in the year 2015. That was one of it's a website that had a lot of. I mean, you look up any movie or any television show up to that point, and there are people arguing about plot points, characters, which actor was the best, which director, and whatnot. And so that's where actually Dave and Brian were met by me on that board. Um, let's wrap up the segment, and in our next segment, call it the golden age of General Hospital, and then subsequent, I guess which for me would be the 1980s. The 1990s had a little lull in between those decades, and then we had sort of a silver age in the 1990s. And for anyone who has watched General Hospital this century from 2000 on, the first decade for a lot of people is sort of the lost decade, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. I'm back with Dave and Brian, and we're going to talk in this segment a little bit more specifically about the soap opera General Hospital, which airs on the American Broadcasting Company, I guess, or corporation, is what ABC Network stands for. So, Dave, let's talk a little bit about the arc of your 30 plus years of watching. I mentioned how I feel that the 1980s was sort of the golden age, the 90s were maybe the silver age, and the 21st century. I know I found myself sort of just watching out of habit. There'll be a good day here or there, maybe a good week every so often, but soap operas seem to have, in my opinion, become a thing of the past century. Do you agree with my assessment of the decades and the overall arc?
I would say more or less. I think that the 80s were, well, obviously, you're different ages throughout the time span, so you're seeing it differently.
Yeah,
But the 80s were kind of more goofy, I guess, very entertaining, deeper than it is currently, but not super deep. Then in the 90s was much more about character and dramatic stories, character-driven stories. So I would probably flip those.
yeah,
So that Claire LeBlanc, who was the head writer in the 90s, would be my favorite era. Then followed by the first run of Gloria Monty in the 80s. And I totally agree that the 2000 forward, Uguza was lost. I usually call it the Reign of Terrible
yeah,
under Guza and Phelps and all them those people.
yeah. I
Going
know.
back to the good times, I was going to say with the 80s,
Yeah,
I mentioned earlier about how you like the Prometheus Disc story, which I did too, in that it starts off as one story and then involves half the cast with all these other little stories being swept in. And that to me is one of my favorite kind of stories and something that you can only really see on a soap. You wouldn't see that in a sitcom or an episodic drama. And from the 80s, I also really love the Quartermaines, which we haven't talked much about. They were a
yeah,
horror family. Uh, so I really enjoyed watching them, and I really enjoyed watching the characters. I loved Ginny Weber also,
yeah,
and I loved early Lucy Coe, which is still a vixen.
yeah.
So that whole era, for me, up until about 87, from 81 to 87, was really a lot of fun, and definitely you want to watch every day.
Yeah,
Uh,
you mentioned a good point about there's always the tendency to look at the golden days of yore, and I know you can fall into that trap. But I know when I've looked back and I've watched films and I've got a good critical eye. When I've looked back at clips on YouTube and look back at a 10 or 8 minute just scene with two characters. You look today, you don't even get 8 or 10 minute scenes. There, you would get an 8 or 10 minute scene. I remember on the IMDb board, maybe 8 or 9 months ago, I believe it was, I or someone else had pointed out some scene when the character of the Rick Weber, who was a classic 1980s good cousins, was retconned, as they call it, into being some sexual pervert. Uh, he was opening up some clinic in the fictional town of Port Charles, and he was involved with some boxing, and some mobsters were trying to move in on him. And there were some scenes that showed about 3 or 4 major characters, 7 or 8 of the minor characters, and a lot of background characters. And it flowed so naturally. You could actually think you were there. And yes, the 80s had a lot of the over the top adventure stories, but you don't even get that kind of day to day naturalism today. Every day, when someone stumbles on a secret, no one locks their doors. You see someone at the keyhole or listening in, and oh, I'm going to plan to do an execution of someone, and I'm in the middle of a public place. Well, we should take out Johnny B tomorrow. They weren't that stupid in the writing. Yes, you would have some of the worst stuff was like Casey the Alien story at the late '80s, but there was they treated the audience as a bit smarter than they do today.
yes.
How about you, Brian? Why don't we start? Were you uh, the '80s or '90s? What do you think of the last 30 plus years on General Hospital?
I can echo off of that. Basically, can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay. So the 80s were definitely my favorite. So starting from 80 and until 86, 87. And then I also enjoyed the 90s. The Quartermains are awesome. I'm really sad that they've been devastated. I really do think they need to figure out a way of bringing blood of them back from the dead or wherever they are. And I totally agree that the Guza era or the Dark Ages. I mean, I don't know what they were thinking. It really did become solely focused on Sonny, Jason, Carly, and I'm not a I don't want to rip or on any one person incessantly on this interview, but suffice to say, I don't like it when any show becomes all focused on one character. The only exception to that would have been All My Children and Erica, because to me, she was that show, and the show was her. But I would rather see a lot of characters, and I totally agree with the stories back then where they would get half or more of the cast all wrapped up into one story.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that. So one of the few things I enjoyed from the Guza era was the Metroport hostage crisis, because they actually did have the entire cast involved in that. So I really did enjoy that. So that was one, although bleak, bright spot in the Guza reign of terror. And I am gay, and I don't know if we're supposed to go there, but I actually appreciate Cartini because they've made the show more fun again. And obviously, they're doing a bit of casting in our favor, so I appreciate that. But more than that, it's made the show more fun. However, it's totally ADD. I really was amazed when I went back on YouTube and watched some of the scenes from the 80s that did go on for several minutes, and they really did flow, like you said. Now I feel like I'm watching just a really poorly edited, rapid fire ADD thing. So I would, some happy medium between keeping us engaged and yet making scenes last longer than 30 seconds would be great.
Yeah, and we're not talking about needing to watch Eugene O'Neill in the afternoon. There's a place for that, and I love the best of Eugene O'Neill. I love great drama. I love great films. I can watch a Fellini film or whatnot. But even if you're doing quote unquote lowest common denominator, serial fiction or soap opera or melodrama, there's good melodrama and there's bad melodrama. And just so people who may be listening know, when the fellows have referred to Guza, they mean a fellow named Bob Guza, who for about a decade, the last decade, was the head writer of General Hospital up until a few years ago. Cartini is a mixture of the names Ron Carlivati and Frank Valentini, who are the current showrunners, the head writer and the top guy currently. And then I think a few other names. Claire Labine was a writer for General Hospital, the head writer back in the 90s. Gloria Monti, I think, took over in the late 70s and really lifted General Hospital from near cancellation to becoming a phenomenon for about a decade. But I know myself personally, let's go decade by decade. When I had mentioned the Prometheus disc in the 80s, and then for me, there was a downturn starting in about 88 to about 91. And by about 93, and one of the reasons I disagree with Dave, and I think the 90s weren't as good as the 80s was, it always seemed to me like the disease of the week. I mean, there was BJ's heart transplant. There was Tony getting shot, and I think he was in a wheelchair, and then everyone was getting something. Robin and Stone had AIDS, and so it was just. I mean, it was just like a disease of the week thing. But then the 1990s, you got just the mob, and as I had mentioned, the mob or mafia mob was introduced with the Luke and Laura characters. Then it went away after a few years. It came back in the late 80s with a character named Duke Lavery. Then it sort of went away a little bit again until the character of Sonny Corinthos, played by an actor named Maurice Bernard, came. So why don't we talk a little bit about sort of, I know all of us have complained on the board, I believe, that the show has a sort of skewed, you'd call, I guess, moral or ethical compass, in that the clear bad guys were shown for about 15 years as being heroes, whereas the good guys were shown as being bad. What do you think that has affected the show? And do you think, because I know a lot of people who don't watch General Hospital any longer precisely for that reason. What do you guys think of that?
Well, actually, that's the reason one of the reasons why I quit watching. I quit twice, actually. One of the reasons why I quit in around 2002, I think it
Mm.
was, because the show became obsessed with Sonny, and as if that weren't bad enough, it was flip so that Sonny, who was this rapist, drug dealing, underworld criminal type, was the show's hero, and by hero I mean the character that all the other characters kept referring to as wonderful and good-hearted
Yeah.
and kind of downplayed all the criminality, and it was just insane. And he was on all the time. And Bernard is a decent actor or can be, but it was just way too much, and I just couldn't take it. So I left, and then I tuned back in. I guess about 5 6 years later, because all the shows beginning to drop, fall to the radar being canceled, and I thought, well, I wanted to tune in and watch the end of GH, and it was terrible. Then there was a replacement, and it had a resurrection. But I would say that definitely the worst thing that happened to GH for me was Musa and his obsession with Sunny.
How about you, Brian? What do you think about this? Bad guys are good, good guys are bad. Do you think that has contributed to the slide of General Hospital, or do you think the decline of soap operas is something separate, and General Hospital is just going along with the crowd, sort of?
Well, okay, so I have a couple of thoughts on this. First of all, I totally agree with what you just said. Not a fan of everything being focused on Sonny. Nothing against the actor, but it was just total overkill on the character. It just made the show very, very dark. And again, that is one thing I do credit Cartini with, is making the show lighter again, even though we still have mob stuff going on. As far as the decline in soaps in general. I do think that it's just an unfortunate symptom of our times that, back in the heyday of the 80s, you only had three channels. At least we did. I grew up in rural Wisconsin. So you didn't have a lot of choices. Therefore, you got a lot more people funneled into one show. So I think that's part of it. Now, frankly, I'm a little surprised that subs haven't kicked back up, because now everybody's got a DVR.
Yeah.
So you can totally watch whatever you want when you want. And that's actually helped me get back into, I watch almost everything that's on now, which isn't hard because we're down to 4 shows and I watch 3 of them. But I really do hope that this isn't the death knell. I hope that things continue to improve. But yeah, I do think that GH lost a lot of people by focusing on such a small, and the whole idea of making a murderer, rapist, drug dealing mobster a hero while making what general society would consider good people bad. It's like this inverse moral compass. It's very messed up.
And the interesting thing is, and I don't want to talk too much about like the IMDb board, but the two characters that are probably the biggest culprits in bringing this kind of attitude about the good is bad, bad is good, were the previously mentioned Sonny Corinthos character, and before him the Luke Spencer character, because Luke Spencer in a sense was, I mean, he became the savior. And we mentioned the Ice Princess story. He saved the world from being frozen. But it should be noted, probably the most famous single incident in soap opera history was the 1979 rape of Luke by Laura. And I know for about 20 some years, whenever I'd start a new job, or if I talked with people who were friends who knew, this was before the internet, there were always these obsessed Luke and Laura fans. And I always thought it was so perverse. It's like, that this raped this woman, and you're going to have the rape victim fall in love with the rapist, and for like 18 years, the ABC company that owns General Hospital utterly denied that it took place, and they did what they call a retcon, and they made it a seduction. And I think while in the short term for the 1980s, it was a great boon to have what they called a super couple in Luke and Laura, and then Robert and Holly were a super couple, and Frisco and Felicia were a super couple, and so on for the next decade or so. I think in the long term, that's where the seeds of the show's souring were planted. What do you guys think about the Luke Spencer character, at least in the beginning? And we'll talk about his evolution to the current day and the current mess of his character. But Brian, how about you? What do you think about?
Well, okay, so I have to admit, I started watching when I was a little kid, and it was all very exciting. And I hadn't actually seen, I only saw the rape in flashbacks.
Yeah,
And at the time, I was, very enthralled with the adventure stuff and Luke and Laura being together. But I, even back then, I was like, okay, can we watch somebody else other than Luke? So I did get a little tired of everything. Really like Laura, so go figure.
yeah,
But anyway, as far as him redeeming himself, I think that's one of the things that I found more palatable. Okay, yeah, it was horrible that he raped her, and it's unbelievable that she would fall in love with him. I mean, I've heard of Stockholm syndrome with kidnappers, but
yeah,
not rapists. So, but the difference being Luke versus Sonny is that eventually Luke was redeemed and he did mostly good things. Sonny has never really stopped doing bad things. He's never really been redeemed. They seem to want to airbrush his bad stuff away from the past, like we'll forget it, but with the internet, we're not going to forget it.
Well, like you, both of you mentioned, Sonny was a rapist himself. He drugged one of the main characters and a few minor characters. It was strongly suggested to the point where there was a friend character of Sonny's that roofied the girls. Then we know that he dealt drugs because these characters got AIDS from his drugs. And yet, just like with the people who denied Luke raped Laura, you have the Sonny fans that will deny that happened. And what always gets me is when people will say, "Well, can you prove something happened?" It's like, do you really think that I'm going to go through, what is it, 50, 60,000 hours, even if that was all available on YouTube, to prove some minor point? When I saw that, anyone who watched the show knows that Luke raped Laura, knows that Sonny dealt drugs and so forth, and it just seems. I mean, you can be a fan. I was not a great fan, for example, of the Erica Kane character. I thought she dominated all my children too much, and I was never a big fan of Susan Lucci, her portrayal as an actress that much. But you know, there's just an amount, I don't know, of overkill. Dave, why don't you? What are your thoughts about the character of Luke Spencer, played by Anthony Geary?
It's funny because everybody who doesn't watch the show, who never watched the show, will at least know who Luke and Laura were.
Yeah,
And they were probably characters that I could never really get into or really care all that much about. I started watching in August '81, so the whole Summer on the Run, Frank Smith storyline was before me,
yeah,
and as was the rape. To me, when I knew about the rape anyway, but I always saw it as sort of like some sort of rip off of the Harlequin Lotus Ripper type story, where the hero just
yeah,
forces the girl who really wants it, the
yeah,
heroine, which is twisted in itself, but that's how I saw it.
yeah.
And I think back then that was probably more the prevailing thought than the more socially proper, politically correct viewpoint today about what rape is. Luke was always kind of a braggart. He was always kind of loud, kind of obnoxious to me. He was always everywhere. And he was not my favorite character. Now, plus, I thought he looked like a clown with the orange hair. No offense to Tony Geary, but I did not understand the appeal at all.
Yeah.
And I wanted to mention something also with Sunny that we've said like negative things about Sunny, but I think the important, for me anyway, the important thing to say is that I think the character of Sunny is really interesting. I just hate the way that he's done on the show. I think that he ought to be a true villain
Yeah,
and
exactly.
embrace his villainy, and not be made to be a hero and to be adulated by townspeople and to always win over, frankly, better people.
Yeah.
What he did to AJ Quartermain twice was disgusting.
Yeah, and
Um,
and just so people know, the character of Sonny started out as a bad guy. In year one of Sonny, it was no doubt raping these girls. They showed him he I think one time he trashed the Kelly's diner with Ruby. they showed him getting beaten up in boxing matches by both the character of Jagger, played by Antonio Sabato, and then the AJ character, then played by Sean Kanan. And then all of a sudden, so people know.
Hey, didn't he try to beat up Ruby Anderson?
I think. Well, I don't know if he beat the Ruby character. I think they held her and were going to, but someone walked in. I don't think they were going to show him beating up an old woman, but the thing is, they showed him as a scumbag, and there was one scene I remember that someone on the IMDb board had linked to that showed Sonny coming to Karen, the character of Karen Wexler, one of the main characters at the time that he had raped, and he was sort of trying to apologize at this time. And it should be said, on another soap opera called One Life to Live, there was a character called Todd Manning who later came on General Hospital, and he was sort of like, he was another rapist character that drew a lot of fire. I think it was maybe 5 or 6 months before Sonny came on General Hospital. The character of Todd Manning had led a violent gang rape of a character on that show, and ABC got the shits, I think, because there were a lot of protests and a lot of people writing in. So that's why I believe they swept the whole Sonny rape thing under the cover. But Sonny was a great villain. And I remember even seeing the commercials before Sonny came on, because the Maurice Bernard actor was he spent 3 or 4 years on All My Children as a character called Nico Kelly, and he was immensely popular there. He left for a year or two to try his hand at big films, came back to ABC on General Hospital, and they promoted him as a real gangster, i.e. meaning he looks Italian, he spoke Italian, he had Italian connections in New York, rather than these Franks, what real mobster's named Frank Smith, and the guy who played him was like an aristocrat, so it was kind of silly. And Maurice Bernard was a wonderful bad guy, and then they made him a hero. Go ahead, Dave. I see you wanted to talk.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I agree with that. But I found him a lot more interesting. I would find him a lot more interesting today if they went that route instead of trying to shoehorn him into this hero role. I think also it's kind of interesting is that we keep talking about the rapists, is that it's the difference between how men view it and how women view it. And that I think one of the reasons why rapists are so prevalent, or rapist heroes are so prevalent on these shows, is it ties into taps into some sort of rape fantasy that women might have, but men just see it as a horrendous crime. We don't see the romance in it, and obviously it's skewed that way. It's nobody jumping out of bushes. It's usually more of a seduction type.
Yeah, you're gonna catch grief for this remark about the rape fantasy. I'll bet you anyone who see because I'll post this link on the board. You're gonna catch grief about the rape fantasy remark. But go ahead.
No, I think that's definitely got to be some of it. I mean, you can read the message boards from the women who talk about Sonny as being so handsome with the dimples. Even on the show, they talk about it. And it's clearly built into some sort of romanticized view of a man who takes what he wants, which in this case was rape. Now, he only did it once, or at least they showed us once. Yeah. They implied it done before off camera, 20 years ago. I think also a major difference between Luke and Sonny is that Luke was a villain when he very first started, reformed, and did heroic acts up until recent times. Whereas Sonny has remained, and I think Brian would talk about this, Sonny has remained this thug, this disgusting, slimy, sleazy creature that we're supposed to be rooting for, and it makes the show very hard to watch.
Yeah, they redeemed Luke, but Sonny has always continued doing bad things. 2 other things related to what you were just saying, I was going to add. The dating site OkCupid actually has one of the questions in it that says, "Are rape fantasies acceptable to you?" Or something to that effect. And so it immediately made me think of General Hospital. The other thing I was going to add is I've watched Days of Our Lives over the years off and on since around 1980, 81 as well. And I love Stefano DiMera. So I don't know if you guys have watched that much, but he's a villain.
Yeah.
He's always been a villain. There's never been any question that he's a villain. and they make no apologies for it. And that is something I can get into. Whereas this, oh, you're a villain, but we're supposed to, you're okay.
Yeah, it's like Cesar Faison or Helena Castine.
Exactly. I love Elena.
And,
I
and
love Helena too.
and the thing about the rape stuff too is that I found particularly noxious is rapes for 20, 25 years were always used on ABC soaps, at least, and I've heard on other networks, to redeem bad girls. Laura Weber was a bad girl, redeemed by rape. Elizabeth Weber in the 90s, redeemed by being raped, supposedly. Uh, uh, on All My Children, there was a famous rape of Will Cortland raping Gloria Marsh, a con artist, bad girl, and she got redeemed.
Yep.
And and so and Todd Manning's victim, whose name slips my mind, was also a quote unquote bad girl, redeemed by Todd Manning's rape somehow. And it's just a bizarre mindset. And a sociologist listening, well, if 50, 100 years from now, cyber archaeologists or sociologists look back at old YouTube clips and I've actually seen, if you Google Todd Manning, Luke and Sonny don't have a psychological profile, but on Wikipedia, I think it is, if you Google Todd Manning's name, you'll find articles in psychological journals about the development of the Todd Manning character, which I find fascinating because Roger Howarth, who played the Todd Manning character, who's now on GH, he once played Todd Manning, and because of legal stuff, now plays a different character. But he was a great actor back in the '90s. But it's just fascinating to read how people viewed these characters. But anyway, let's get a little lighter and talk about the '90s. You had mentioned, Dave, I believe, that the Quartermaines, and I love the David Lewis version of Edward Quartermaine in the '80s. But I think the 1990s were primetime Quartermaines with the Jason and AJ characters coming to life. Lila Quartermaine was still around. Edward was played by John Ingle. Both Monica and Alan were in their, I guess, dramatic primes. They were still, characters of some substance. Would you agree? Well, Brian, were you a fan of the Quartermaines? Would you agree that the '90s were basically the Quartermaines' golden era?
I totally agree with that. I don't. One of you said earlier that the '90s was a lot of disease of the month
Yeah,
and a lot of hand wringing and that kind of thing. But the Quartermaines always offset that for me.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed the Quartermaines, and like I said before, I wish they'd bring them back.
Even their help was funny and were well developed characters.
Yes.
Yeah, but there was a lot of that in the '80s. Actually, for
Yeah.
me, the Quartermaines of the '80s were the prime time.
Yeah.
I loved David Lewis. I never liked John Ingle, although I think he was a great actor, and I miss him now since his death. But David Lewis was always Edward Quartermaine to me. Lila was more involved in acting because she was in better health, the actress. Alan and Monica were starring and having affairs. You had Jimmy Lee, you had Celia, you had Raina Sharp running around. So there were a lot of Quartermaines back then. And then in the '90s, to me, it was a little bit darker Quartermaines because you had AJ's alcoholism, you had the rivalry between Ned and AJ and Jason, and you had Monica's breast cancer. Lila was taking a turn for the worst with her health. Edward had amnesia. I mean, some darker things started happening. But to me, the Quartermaines in the '80s were very funny and very character specific and very human and very relatable, despite being this ridiculously wealthy family in the middle of a sleepy town.
Yeah, and the Quartermaines are basically the General Hospital version, I guess you would say. Well, I guess they're Republicans, so I couldn't say the Kennedys, maybe the Bushes. So they're the Bushes of the fictional universe of General Hospital. Moving on then to the 2000s, we've spoken of Sonny, but we talk about fans of General Hospital. We'll talk about sort of the terrible trio of the lost decade or so, and that would be Sonny, who we previously mentioned, but also the character of Jason Quartermaine, who became Jason Morgan after getting a head injury in a drunk driving accident with his sibling AJ, and then also Luke Spencer's niece, Carly, or actual Caroline Benson, I guess is the character's real name, but she's used a variety of aliases and married names over the years. played initially by the brilliant Sarah Brown, who I think is by far the best Carly and one of the best actresses ever on soaps, and has been played by other actresses. And those three characters sort of became the core characters of the first decade of this century. What do each of you think about what we would call the terrible trio? Brian, how about you? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's everybody knows I don't like Sunny, so we've talked about that.
Yeah.
Jason, I used to like, but unfortunately, I don't know if it was the writing, the actor, the direction, but he was like watching a one note, no emotion, which I understand is supposed to be the character,
Yeah.
but I've mysteriously seen that same actor on another soap now, and it's not much different. But it was just like watching a rock, and I'm like, Stone Cold is a very appropriate, yeah. Anyway, and Carly, I love and hate. I loved her as Sarah Brown. Didn't really care for the next two, but I actually do like the current actress Laura Wright that plays her. And I realize she's a very different Carly from the other Carlys, but I actually do really enjoy her. So that was the saving grace for me, was of watching the three of them. Even though I'm gay, I'd rather watch Carly than Sunny and Jason.
Well, let me before you go, Dave. Let me just, Brian. The thing that with the Laura Wright version is, I think she's a solid actress. I don't think she can elevate material. But the antics that the character of Carly did with Sarah Brown, who when she came on was a college co-ed age, early 20s. Now that you have Laura Wright, a 40-year-old, she's still a 20-year-old character, and for me, it's just how can do do they not believe in the progression of characters? I mean, characters have to grow. You want to grow with these characters. As much as I've mentioned that I wasn't a fan of Erica Kane, the Erica Kane of 1982 was much more immature than the Erica Kane of 2008. That quarter century, she did grow. She was still a narcissistic, selfish character, but she was a more adult narcissist. What do you agree that they poorly written Carly, Brian?
I do. I actually do think Laura Wright is a great actress. I think she could do more, but with the material she's given, I think she's doing the best she can.
Okay, how about you, Dave?
With the trio,
The trio,
I
and
think,
then the writing.
yeah, I was gonna say I think Sonny's been talking to death, but as for Jason, I think there's a reason why his nickname was Jesus. He was always running around saving the world, being a great guy in between killing people for a living. Uh, that whole dichotomy was weird for me, I guess. I didn't particularly care for the actor either. His first couple of years as Morgan, when he had the injury and he was sort of rebuilding his life, maybe it was a year-long story, I thought was really interesting. But then when he slipped into Sunny's orbit, it just got really dark and silly. I liked his, oddly enough, I liked his romance with Robin. I don't generally like the romantic stories. For some reason, those two together was really good. I think they called him the boy with no past and the girl with no future because she had AIDS.
Yeah.
That story was really good. But most of Jason has been horrible. And even the new Jason had mixed feelings. As for Carly, I loved Sarah Brown. I thought she was fantastic and incredibly watchable. And the character was a lot more interesting up until, again, she got into Sunny's orbit. And then when that happened was around the time I was tuning off. They had the whole Baby Michael story going, and that just killed the show for me. The new Carly, Laura White. I like Laura White as an actor more than I like the character. I don't really think much about Carly anymore. As a character, as a viable character, she seems silly and annoying, frankly. But the actress, I think, is pretty good. Wish she had better stuff to do. And Sunny's still around. So anyway, the trio is not. Unfortunately, they seem to be coming back strong the last few months, and I thought one of the best things that Cartini was doing was diminishing them.
Yeah,
But
the year 2012 was the first year they took over, and that was sort of the Renaissance year for about a year, and then it sort of slipped.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, let's wrap up this segment, and in our next segment, let's talk about the show of the last few years, the Cartini years, and the current years, and specifically about the evolution of the Luke Spencer character into what became known as Fluke, a hyphenate for fake Luke, as the actor Tony Geary did what seems to have been, what was it, the good twin, bad twin? People didn't know for a while, and we'll talk about that in a moment. In this segment, I want to talk with Brian and Dave basically about the current era of General Hospital from 2012 to 2015 as we tape now here in late April of 2015. So we talked about Guza, the Guza era, and there was a couple of minor head writers in between his era from last decade. And then the people who had been running the soap opera One Life to Live until its cancellation in 2012, a few months after All My Children was canceled, were called collectively Cartini. Frank Valentini, the showrunner, and the head writer Ron Carlivati. And Ron Carlivati had a reputation of recycling his own stories, so people call him Rerun. And but the first year, 2012, that they came on, General Hospital had languished for a decade with the whole mafia stuff. It was basically Sonny's enemy of the month, or the sweeps period. You'd have a mafia family come on, or some psycho, and Sonny, by this time he had not only been a rapist and a murderer and a drug dealer, but he became a terrorist that could have been executed under the Patriot Act. But then Cartini came, and we got three of the core characters from the One Life to Live show. John McBain, a detective, patterned after, I think, the Elmore Leonard character McBain. And then you got Todd Manning, the aforementioned rapist, and his daughter, Star Manning. Those three characters came on. So let's talk, if either one of you want to jump in. And what did you think about the first year of Cartini and the One Life to Live characters, and then also the GH veterans starting to come back? Either one of you.
Well, I watched One Life to Live for 3 or 4 years in the early 80s and not much since.
Yeah.
Had I been a bigger One Life to Live fan towards the end of the run, I probably would have been ecstatic to see some of my characters come onto a show that's still on the air.
Yeah.
Well, not having watched One Life to Live, for like the last 20 years it was on, I didn't really care for them. I grew to, tolerate them. But yeah, it was just like, okay, wait a minute, this is our sandbox, and now you're forcing your people into it, and I was rather resentful. Now, aside from the One Life to Live characters, I was ecstatic because I didn't like the Guza era, and I knew from being aware of what's going on in the soap world that Cartini did do things lighter and more fun, and they did do a good job of bringing in vets. So overall, very happy with Cartini, but wasn't really thrilled with the original trio of One Life to Live people, nor the recycled characters that they had to become due to the whole Prospect Park nightmare.
And just so people know, in the year after All My Children and One Life to Live were canceled, the ABC television network sold the rights to those two shows and their characters to a company called Prospect Park, which tried to revive both of those soap operas on an online basis. They were actually well produced and fairly well acted and fairly well written shows. They only lasted about 6 months. The company of Prospect Park went bankrupt. They then sued ABC, claiming that ABC had damaged them in the year 2012 by having the three One Life to Live characters on General Hospital do certain things that they claimed would damage them. And most soap fans think it's a bunch of nonsense. But since then, ABC couldn't use those characters, but they kept the three actors, renamed them as new characters that came on for new storylines. And so that was sort of the whole brouhaha that I think probably took a very promising first year, and I don't think the show's recovered from that since. Would you agree, Dave?
Well, I think that when Prospect Park filed the lawsuit and ABC put the kibosh on what Cartini was working on, that probably killed some spirit of theirs, is my assumption.
Yeah.
And that they did have to do some major rewriting, some well, if they even do long-term planning, they probably have to reschedule the long-term planning. Going back to the beginning when they first started in 2012, I have to say that first year was amazing because I had grown so tired and weary and resigned to what the show had become that it was literally like opening a window on a house that had been shuttered for years.
Yeah.
And it was great. And I loved from the onset. I never watched One Life to Live, by the way. I loved from the onset Todd Manny. I thought he was great. I thought Howard was fantastic. So I got into that character really fast. Sky was kind of a waste of time and space for me. And McBain, I was indifferent to. I didn't really care that much for Sam, and McBain was kind of like a meh character. But Todd, I thought was great. And 2012 by itself was, I thought, pretty amazing. A really fast-moving, fun, history-driven, character-focused entertainment vehicle. It was a great year for them. And then I guess was it 13 when the Prospect Park thing happened?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's probably when things really took a turn for the worst. I didn't like what they were doing to some of the veterans that were coming back. I would love that they brought the veterans back, but didn't like that Heather was continuing to become further and further ridiculous.
Yeah.
Boozer started that, but they continued it. I didn't like that AJ was brought back to become a buffoon yet again, and then killed. Anna has been incredibly dumbed down. Anna Devane, who was once a police commissioner and a double agent. She used to be brilliant, now she's basically an idiot. So that stuff has been kind of bad for me. Everybody calls it cartoony. I usually call it cartoony because everything is so over the top and just too much. And that I wish they would tone down.
Yeah. So getting us to 2013 and the new characters, they brought on a soap veteran named Maura West, and we talked about bringing back characters. They brought back, and this was a turn back after the breather and the relegation, not the relegation, but the pushing aside of the Sonny, Carly, Jason trio. They killed off the Jason character supposedly, some new characters, and one of the characters that they brought back new was a resurrection of the Julian Jerome mobster character. And originally he was a very dull character, and they brought back a guy named Will DeVry to play a new actor to play an old character. They retconned a lot of stuff, but they brought Maura West, this actress. I think she was from Days of Our Lives, and they brought her on to play a mobster sister, and then that sort of led to the return of Sonny Corinthos towards the center of the show. What do you guys think about the return of the Jerome family and their various stories like Julexis, the Julian Alexis romance, and the current storyline where the daughter Kiki Jerome has now been drugging her former lover? What are your thoughts on that arc?
Well,
Go ahead, Brian.
oh, okay. Okay, well, first of all, I love Mara West. I watched As the World Turns off and on for a lot of years too. She was one half of a super couple As the World Turns for probably a decade or more. So that was her main gig.
Oh, okay. I
did.
thought it was Days of Our Lives.
No, it was As the World Turns. And then she did go to Young and the Restless for maybe a year. But that didn't really work out. So I was very happy when they brought her to General Hospital. I like her character. I like the Julian Jerome character. I did not like Kiki initially, but she grew on me. In fact, I liked Kiki better than Star, so that worked. But and I'm sorry, I forgot the question.
What do you think about the whole Jerome arc and how that's sort of from 2012's break in the Sonny and Carly stuff, that now Sonny, the Jeromes have basically helped reascend Sonny to the top of the king of the hill again.
I love Alexis, and I love the actress that plays Alexis. So I'm really happy that she got me, and she's with Julian, and I think they're a great couple, and they're really funny together, and I love that aspect of it. Not really caring about the Jerome crime stuff as much, but if I gotta watch a crime family, I'd rather watch the Jeromes than the Sonny stuff.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at with that.
Okay. How about you, Dave?
I guess I'm confused with why the drones are even there. When they were brought on, it was supposed to be, at least maybe this was my wishful thinking, but I thought they were there basically to supplant Sunny
Yeah.
and then become more background characters. And that was their way of waiting them up.
Yeah.
But instead, it's like you said, it's ratcheted everything up, and now it's been front burner for like a year and a half. And it's frustrating because nothing ever happens. It's
Yeah.
just the same two or three tropes repeated in the cycle.
Well,
So
you say that, Dave. Yesterday's show, which would have
oh, I
been
haven't watched it in a couple days, so I'm a little behind.
okay. Well, I don't want to spoil
Go
it
ahead.
for you, but okay. April 24th, they had two supposed hits going down. One from the Jerome family on Duke, and one from Duke on the informant gal Jordan in his own family. And both of the would-be hitmen, Carlos for the Jerome and Bruce for the Corinthos family, are taking forever to take shots. I mean, I could have gone, ordered an ice cream cone, come back and eaten it, and these supposed sharpshooters haven't taken a shot. I mean, it's ridiculous.
No, and also I really don't see the guy who plays Duke or even the guy who plays Jerome, Julian, for that matter, as being anything close to mob-like. They seem that none of it's believable.
Yeah.
Plus, it's hilarious that these are like organizations that are supposed to be ruling the whole Eastern Seaboard crime syndicate, and there's like 4 people on their staff.
It's like they live in the retarded universe. You know, the Bizarro. There's the Superman. I haven't read Superman comic, but there's Bizarro Superman who's like a retarded Superman. That's the Paul Charles universe.
Yeah. But I do like the actors though. I do like Morowitz, and I do like DeBrey.
Yeah.
But I get so bored watching it because nothing ever freaking happens.
Yeah.
And everything is like built up as this is the moment, and then nothing. So that gets after a while the horse doesn't want the carrot anymore.
Yeah, and another thing they have to the Cartini got all his killing or New York. Port Charles, by the way, for those listening, is supposedly set near the city of Rochester in upstate New York.
Or Buffalo.
Yeah. Yeah. But let's talk about two of the most frustrating aspects of the last couple of years, though, 14 and 15. Late 2013 or no, early last year was the death of A.J. Quartermain, the murder of A.J. Quartermain, played by Sean Kanan. And then we'll talk about the Luke Spencer / Fluke Spencer storyline. But as I think Dave had mentioned, A.J. Quartermain was a fairly popular character. He's been a terminal drunk. He was played as an adult originally by a fellow named Gerald Hopkins in the early 90s. Then he was played by Sean Kanan for a couple of years. Kanan left the role because he, in real life, had some either drug or alcohol problems. They hired a fellow named Billy Warlock, who had been sort of this little guy on Baywatch. And I to this day, I think Sean Kanan is a big, rugged judo champion or something. He's a big, strong bull of a guy. And it was so ridiculous to see Sonny trying to intimidate him years ago. So I believe they hired this little guy, Billy Warlock, who's one of the few actors out there that's probably shorter than Maurice Bernard. And I think that's the real reason. Yeah, and then they killed off. They finally, after 5 or 6 years, killed off the Billy Warlock version of AJ. They bring back in, I guess it was the end of 2012. It was when a few months after they supposedly killed off the Jason character. They brought back Sean Kanan. The rumors are that they promised him they weren't going to make him a drunk that was subservient to the Sonny character. They would rehabilitate AJ, give him. They did that for the first 3 or 4 months, and then they fucked it all up. And so let's talk about what.
Wait, we're allowed to curse on this? Now you tell me?
Oh yeah. This is the internet. It's not FCC regulated. So Brian or Dave, either one of you want to talk about AJ, whether you like the character at all in the early days?
I loved AJ. I loved actually AJ going back to Gerald Hopkins, so it had to be the character more than the actors.
Yeah.
There was just something that was likable about him because even though he was a loser and did horrible things, he seemed incredibly human and I don't know, vulnerable. Maybe he tapped into that sense that all men have about their worth or their capabilities. That's how it read for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I really got into that character. So watching him get progressively trashed on the show and then brutalized by Sonny over the baby Michael thing killed it for me. Like I said, around 2002 or so.
Yeah.
So I was really excited when they brought him back. I skipped mostly Billy Warlock, by the way.
Yeah.
Then they brought him back, and I was really excited. And I thought, wow, this is great. They got him hooked up with Liz Weber, and he seemed to be heading towards ELQ, the fictional corporation on the Quartermains. And I thought, this is great. You know, this is a really smart move, and I think a lot of people are jazzed about it. And then, like you said, they totally fucked it up. They went back into the old trope about him being Sonny's punching bag, and it was horrible. You know, it was horrible to watch, and I don't think the show, for me, the show hasn't recovered from there. And I know a lot of people dropped out of watching from that.
Yeah, and you know the thing with the AJ character, I know we talked about some of the female viewers of the show, like on the IMDb boards, especially that a handful of them were complaining because the reason they killed off AJ this time was supposedly that the AJ character thought that he had killed the character of Sonny's girlfriend, Connie, who was a psychotic mess at the time. And the character, the previously mentioned Maura West character, was the one who really murdered Connie cold-bloodedly. And melodramatically, they had her type. They had Connie put AJ in blood on the floor, pointing to AJ Quartermain when it was really Ava Jerome, the character that killed her. But you know, why not just Ava? You know. But so anyway, then Sonny, who had stolen AJ's son years ago, promised his son that he wouldn't kill AJ, the biological father. Ava sort of tricked him to a degree. Sonny murders AJ. He finds out about it. Sonny finally confesses after Michael confronts him. He gets sent to jail. But the AJ character had some and whatnot, and it just screwed it all up. But Brian, how about you? What were you ever an AJ fan or indifferent? I was kind of indifferent to the character, although I liked some of the stuff that happened. But how about his return? What did you think about that?
Well, I always liked Sean Kanan in the role. So the first time in the when he came back,
Yeah.
And I was thoroughly annoyed that they screwed over the actor and the character by redeeming him and then killing him off. I mean, it was just completely stupid.
Yeah.
I never really cared for Billy Warlock in the role. I didn't understand how you can go from being a 6'3", pretty big guy to being this 5'5" little tiny guy. It's worst casting ever.
Yeah.
And so anyway,
and Warlock was a decent actor. I'm not saying he was a terrible actor, but it's sort of it's the closest you can get to sort of cross racial. You know, if you're going to have Othello, I mean, you can't have a guy who starred in martial arts films. You know, Jackie Chan can't play Othello.
Right. Exactly. So I pretty much agree with what you guys said. It's like it's a total waste of a legacy character. And I don't understand why they did it. And once again, Sonny wins, and it's that again. Now, one of the things, and maybe we'll get on this subject later. One thing I do want to say is there are a lot of characters on the show, past and present, that I really really like, but they're seldom the focus. So
well, we'll talk about that in our next segment. I'll let you guys talk about what you want then.
Okay.
But let's then move on from AJ and wrap this segment up and talk about the evolution, or if you want to be accurate, I would say the devolution of the Luke Spencer character. We'd mentioned this, and along with Erica Kane, Luke Spencer is probably one of the 3 or 4 characters in soap history that will be, remembered. I think. I mean, for his iconic, he was instrumental in making soaps mainstream, and there's no denying that. I myself preferred Geary, and I think he only became a really good actor when he played another character, Bill Eckert. I know, Dave, you're not a fan of the Bill Eckert character, no. but I think Geary's acting was superb then. Whereas when I look at some of the late 70s stuff, you can see he wasn't a fully formed actor. But nonetheless, the character of Luke, after the rape, spent 18 years in denial. He was off the show for about 7 years. They finally brought the rate back up again in the late 90s. Then they brought the Cassadine family from the Ice Princess story back, and I'm condensing about 20 years in 20 seconds. He then spent the next decade as a drunk and a loser. The most dastardly thing that he did, although he wantonly murdered, and it should be said, on General Hospital, they have what the term is called red shirts from Star Trek. You know, how all the characters in red shirts will all die in a Star Trek episode. Luke and Sonny wantonly murder every red shirt out there. They probably racked up a body count over 100 each. So, but red shirts don't count as murder, I guess. So, but then, so the worst thing Luke did then in the last 15 or so years was kill his grandson by drunk driving, and that was about 3 or 4 years ago. And I think that was I think before Cartini came back in like 2011. Yeah, and so then for the next few years, I don't know if you can say he was redeemed from that, and it's arguable which is worse, drunk driving, killing a tot, or raping your one true love, supposedly. They involved him with the Tracy Quartermain character. He was a scam artist. He battled stuff. And ever since he came back for the last 25 years on the show, he always took about 3 or 4 months vacation in the middle of the year to go off. The powers that be have used this vacation time in what could have been a very interesting way. They had the Heather Weber character drug Luke. He went to a sanitarium. He comes out. He's a totally different person. Some people thought that he was the Bill Eckert character. I know I was one of the first people within a day. I said, it's got to be Bill Eckert. How many doppelgangers can someone have running around? The Bill Eckert character had been killed off and died in Luke's arms, by the way, back in '91. Then, again, I'm just doing a major condensation here. Then it looked like that's where they were going with the Bill Eckert. Geary goes on another vacation. They come back, and all of a sudden he's got multiple personalities. So let's talk about the last 6, the Luke Fluke. What do you think about this? To me, I think it was a mess, and we can talk specifically about the April 1st episode flashback. But what do you think about Fluke Luke?
Okay, so wow, you said a lot of stuff in a short time. So once upon a time, I liked Luke. As a little kid, I was drawn to that. It was cool. But after a while, I got tired of everything being focused on him.
Yeah.
And he had his good points and his bad points, and that's all fine. I absolutely hate the whole Fluke thing.
Yeah.
I feel like they did a total cop out.
Right.
That they started writing it.
Yes.
And didn't know where to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think they caved in because fans aren't stupid. Who could it have been if not Eckert? And they said, and after the April 1st episode, which supposedly gave the backstory of why Luke became Fluke, and we'll talk about that in a moment, they admitted that, I remember I found something where Tony Geary, who basically brainchild did the Fluke character, basically said, well, after a while I just gave in and let Rerun Carlavati just make him, multiple personality head case. And so, yeah, I agree totally. It was a cop-out.
Yeah, and I just feel like they wrote themselves into a corner, and this was the only way out.
Yeah. How about you, Dave?
I have mixed feelings because I think on paper it's actually a really good idea. I think that they're going back to the origin. This is something that Gary has often said that he wanted to do, was revisit the dark side, the dark origins of Luke. And I think that the idea of somebody having, it wasn't really a split personality, I think, so much, but it was, or maybe it was, I don't know, it was a split sidekick. I'd almost rather have that story than yet another doppelganger.
Oh, yeah.
Or mask, duplicating mask situation.
Yeah.
So it didn't bother me that much. However, I wish they had planned that from the beginning, because clearly they did not.
Yeah.
And it's a whole bunch of plot holes and inconsistencies and red herrings that were not unintentional red herrings. So that, for me, made the case suffer. Also, I'm not as interested as I thought I would be in watching Tony Geary recoil in horror at his own image. Yeah. That gets kind of old after a while, or scared by a tattoo, Yeah. But the concept was, I thought, pretty good.
I think it was a good idea to revisit. what I would have liked to have seen, and then I'll get into the April 1st episode. What I would have liked to have seen is them have Luke's father be alive. To have the one person who could scare the bejesus out of Luke would have been great. Even if Luke's father was played by an 85-year-old man, I'm sure there are some former Broadway actors or B film actors from the 70s or in their 80s who could have done a real serviceable job. Because the thing is, and I guess we'll get to the 4-1 show, is it retconned almost 4 decades of stuff that we had seen. Because well, let me just summarize again. On the April 1st show, they did a flashback which tried to work in the first episode of General Hospital in 1963 with the Luke character who didn't come until 15 years later. And basically what they did was say that Luke had accidentally killed his mother with a bat in an argument, and then blamed his father who harangued him, and then murdered his father. And he covered it up, and he forgot about it. A sister that they had originally mentioned in the 70s had been forgotten for 35 years, like Richie Cunningham's brother on Happy Days. They bring her back, played by Dee Wallace of E.T. fame. She's on for 3 days, does a wooden acting job. Just they could have gotten any actress to play the role. Luke has a meltdown. He remembers that he murdered the father. The reason that he was obsessed with his cousin Bill Eckert was because Bill Eckert was there. But they retconned the whole history. And I had gotten into an argument with one of the people on the website about a lot of these what they call wikia sites online where fans can go in and write anything on. I know Star Trek fans who recoil at episode recounts that are off, but they had on some wikia sites saying that the character Ruby Anderson, Aunt Ruby, who first appeared in the 70s, wasn't blood related to Luke. And one guy was saying she wasn't. It says it on the wikia site, and I'm saying that's wrong. And I said, I know, I saw it. Ruby was a Spencer, but they mixed up the blood ties instead of looking back into their own archive and having a General Hospital historian. How much can it cost to have someone who knows the histories of the characters? They looked on these wikia sites, pulled crap off that none of the pieces fit, because it made Luke and Bobby, his sister character, it meant that they were deceived by their Aunt Ruby for decades. It meant because I know 100% for a fact in the mid 80s that Tim Spencer was supposedly alive, and Ruby had shown letters to the Bobby character when Luke was off the show. And so Ruby was hiring someone to forge letters. I mean, they forget about these things, but devoted fans don't. And it's like, there was just so many retcons on that show. And
Dan, if I can interrupt for a second, I think that's actually a problem that you kind of addressed, that the writers, and they keep changing, for the audience that isn't loyal. So they'll write whatever they want to write, with whatever history they want to write. They'll eschew continuity and history. And basically writing for the now. And that kills audience loyalty, so that these shows eventually are just going in short spurts of loyal base fans. So that's I think it's kind of interesting that they would take the time to revisit an actual bit of history, Pat, and then just totally wipe away everything else that has happened between the intervening 35 years.
How about you, Brian? Did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, basically, I was really excited about it when I heard what the episode was going to be, and then I watched it, and I basically watched it in horror. I thought it was terrible. And to just overhaul everything just because they could. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any point to having retconned everything they did.
I think they just gave in to Geary, and it's rumored that he's going to retire, and they just said, well, you've been a loyal employee for, I guess, 25 out of the last 35 years or whatever, and we're just going to let you do what you want. And I know on another blog that I read, a General Hospital blog called the Wub Tub, the person who runs that blog, a woman named Karen, wrote a long screed about how she hates Tony Geary now because he basically spat on all his fans. And it seems to me when you have serial fiction fans, whether it's old-time movie serial people, the few who are still alive, or soap opera fans, are loyal. why do you think that we watch, what is it, 240, 250 hours of this? Well, maybe with the commercials, it's only maybe 200 hours, but it's still a hell of a lot more than any other primetime soap show can do in a year. We watch because we want to see the characters progress. We want to see them have a baby. They go through a divorce. Someone has an affair. Someone gets lung cancer or whatnot. Or they go on an adventure, and then you say to your audience, "Well, you remember that incident that happened back in 1997? Well, it's Bobby Ewing in Dallas coming out of the shower. That never happened." Ugh. Anyway, but so you didn't like the 4-1 show. How about you, Dave? What did you think of the actual show? Forgetting about
You
what
know,
it did.
I can say this about almost anything over the last 2 or 3 years in this show. I thought it was a very clever idea,
Yeah.
horribly executed.
Mm.
I don't know what the problem was. It seemed silly watching it. I think they were just trying something different, and I don't want to piss on that because I think that's really great that they're trying and they're trying to be creative. And I think the idea was interesting, but it just didn't gel. I think it didn't make a whole lot of sense. I think was the biggest problem, and it felt shoehorned. And I don't know, it didn't resonate with me at all from somebody who's been watching for 35 years.
Yeah, I know. It's like I appreciated when they did the 3 Carlys episode, when they did the four Jasons episode, when they had Luke the Luke intervention episode. That was interesting. But my aside from all the just taking a shit on the fans that watch, the two things that got me about that particular episode was, and I don't know if I think I mentioned it in some of the posts that I made, but there was the black and white scenes in the past. You could see color seeping through. I saw whole rainbows of color, and I know it wasn't on my TV because I looked on YouTube and I saw the same thing, and so they didn't even want to pay a professional to make it black and white. And then the character who played the young Bill and young Luke character, I think his name was Joey Luthman, I thought was horrendous. One of the other posters there agreed with me when I said you could see him pause for 2 or 3 seconds in reaction to Tony Geary, who played the father of Luke. You could see him, and you could see the wheels in his mind going, "Okay, what do I say? What do I say? And then he'd say it, and I'm like, and then people were saying, "Oh, he was so terrific." What the fuck are you watching? I mean, yeah, we can disagree. You can argue with me. Oh, Robert De Niro was a better actor than Orson Welles, but Jesus Christ, this kid sucked. But Dave, go ahead and wrap
Well,
up.
I'll just say the black and white stuff. From what I remember, I only watched it the one time. The black and white stuff didn't bother me. The color that seeped through, I thought was intentional, sort of like Schindler's List when you see the little red coat, because you saw the red blood and you saw the flushed cheeks that were red.
Oh no, I wasn't talking about that. I'm talking about there were whole bands of color that came, and you could if you've ever seen like old black and white movies that are too grainy. Sometimes you see little grains of color. I don't know if you ever see that sort of rainbow stripe in a poorly digitized copy. That's what it looked like to me. That someone just didn't digitize it or black and white it well enough. But go ahead.
And the kid. Yeah, I didn't really care for the kid either. I mean, I don't want to insult some actor out there, but yeah, it was the girl. But I will say that the one who played the sister, Pat, the girl, she was actually pretty good.
Yeah, she was.
Found Tim Spencer to be, again, this typical with these people, cartoon.
Yeah.
There was no humanity to this man. He was just basically, he might as well have been dressed like an ogre.
Right.
Or Shrek,
And what gets me is they have to make him a bigot because, of course, being a bigot makes him worse than his son, who became a psychopathic murderer and rapist. Archie Bunker was really Ted Bundy's stepchild, but Archie was really much worse. I mean, come on. And the thing. And speaking of retcons, the retcon that I hated the most, other than the Eckert Spencer family retcon, was in his very first oratory. The character Tim Spencer rails against Italians taking jobs on the docks or wherever he's working, and yet his son is named Lucas Lorenzo Spencer. The Luke Spencer character has said he's been Italian, has bragged about having his hot Italian blood to his all Irish aunt Ruby, which would make his father all Irish as well. So, but then again, that's retconned away. Why would a guy who hates Italians name his son Lorenzo if he's not Italian now? It makes no sense. But okay, let's wrap up this segment. In our final segment, I'll give both of the guys their say on what they want to talk about, or any final points that they want to make in anything regarding General Hospital or soaps in general, and we'll do that in just a moment. Well, we're going to end up this little show on soap opera, and I'm going to have Brian and Dave basically just talk about whatever they want to talk about, whether it's about soap operas in general, about General Hospital, specific soaps or whatnot. So, Brian, you had mentioned this, so why don't you get whatever you want to get off your chest?
Okay, well, I just want to add that as far as General Hospital specifically goes, there are a number of characters that are really good that we don't see very much of. So, perfect example is Diane. Absolutely love Diane. I wish she was on all the time. I realize a supporting character like that you're not going to see a lot of, but they underutilize her. And there are a number of people on there that I do really love. That Jane Elliott, I think, is amazing.
Oh yeah.
I wish we saw Leslie Charleston more often. And you know, for the current younger people that are on there now, I really do like Lulu, Dante, Nathan, and those guys. You know, so there is a lot of stuff about the show that I really do like.
There's still potential, yeah.
Yeah, and they just have a tendency to focus on the same people so much that, you know, it's like, and I'll admit, I much prefer the new Jason. So even though we're getting a lot of time with, I guess we're calling him Jake, I actually at least like that actor, and Billy Miller is an amazing actor. I watched him on Young and the Restless for years, so I was really happy when he came on. So I will say that Cartini is doing a good job of getting the best of other shows to come on this one.
Yeah, they've got to write up to their level though, because Billy Miller, I only saw him on All My Children. He played the brother of the crazy character. Yeah, Crazy Annie, and he was terrific on that. As I guess you would call him a bad guy, but yeah, he's got so much more range than Steve Burton, who played for 20 plus years the Jason Quartermain / Morgan character. I agree with that. Any other points, Brian?
Just, you know, putting in a plug for soaps in general. I've watched a lot of things over the years. I watched Dark Shadows,
yeah,
Dynasty, Dallas, Knots Landing. I at some point during the 80s I watched every day, and so I feel that, you know, it's a great genre, and hopefully this isn't the end of it.
Yeah, I know a month or so ago, someone had mentioned, maybe a month or two ago on IMDb, had mentioned Dark Shadows, and I Googled an episode of what amazed me about the Dark Shadows thing is all of these episodes, I think, and I looked up, they don't have the first year. That was a show that became about a vampire in the late 60s and 70s. My God, what great quality, crystal clear, just like it was filmed yesterday. And yet you can look at General Hospital episodes from the 90s, and I guess the aspect ratio is all distorted, and it's crappy, and some of it's in black and white, and it's like you would think Doctor Who fans constantly complain about the lost first 4 or 5 years of that show, but it's like, okay, I guess I could understand why you might not think that 250 episodes a year of a half-hour show in 1963, General Hospital or these other soaps would be worth anything, but I don't know. It just seems really short-sighted, and especially when I see those Dark Shadow, how crisp and clear, and people can enjoy this campy. And I wasn't a great Dark Shadows fan, but I remember when it was rerun in the late 70s. That was another soap, I guess, that I watched. I watched, not religiously, but I mean that just amazing quality. So yeah, I think young people and people who are interested in serial fiction would have a cornucopia, because if they had saved these shows, it would be sort of like Project Gutenberg, where you can read all of the classics of Charles Dickens for free. My God, kids today can, before they go to a library, just download it onto your pod. They could do the same things with these shows and learn and see, especially if you're a young writer or a young actor, you could say, oh yeah, I want to see Susan Lucci in 1975 and compare her to 1995, see if she got any techniques. But it's all lost now. It's just all lost.
Yeah, the one thing I will say about that is they actually have every episode of Dark Shadows on DVD.
Oh
They
yeah.
sell it in a box set. I have it.
Oh,
Of all of those
even
over
the
12,
first year.
they got they got the first year. They got everything. There's one episode. I think it's like 6 episodes prior to the end of the run that they don't have,
Oh,
and that's it. And
oh.
I'm also a Doctor Who fan, so I've got a lot of that. And so yeah, I really do appreciate serial stuff where you can watch characters over a number of years. I just find it enjoyable.
Let me just ask you. You're near my age. Which Doctor Who did you start watching first?
I was late to the game, so
Oh.
instead of starting with Tom Baker like most people our age, I actually started with Peter Davison.
Oh, okay. I
And
actually
so,
started with the guy before Baker, who was pretty good. And then when Baker came, and I watched it on PBS in the '70s. When Baker came, I was just so brilliant. I mean, it's such an absurd show. It's so bad in so many aspects, but he was so brilliant in it. I just loved it too. But how about you, Dave? What's on your mind to wrap up?
Oh, well, I would say I have mixed feelings because I started watching again about 5 years ago, I guess, just to say goodbye basically to the show because the series was terrific lights. But now that it's had its resurgence, I'm back to watching it again. Part of me resents 5 hours a week commitment that I'm making to it. But I'm also enjoying it, and I'm glad that it's doing well. I think that this is a show where the actors are better than the material. Maybe that's true for all of them. I wish that the writers would focus more on characters and a little bit more on realism. They are just too far out there for me.
Yeah.
With the cuteness. I think Brian mentioned a bunch of actors who were really good. I agree. I think James Elliott is genius. Brian and Craig, who plays Morgan, I think is really good.
Yeah.
Amara West too. So there's a lot of really good actors. Alexis Nancy Van is good. But I think that what I'd like to see most is just stuff that's a little bit more relatable, some stuff that's a little bit more human, a little bit more of the Claire Levine era, and a little less of the over the top cartoony stuff.
So let me just ask both of you a final prediction. Do you think General Hospital will still be on the air in the year 2020?
That's 5 years from now.
Yeah.
I'd say not likely would be my guess. Well, not in its current form, not on ABC.
Okay. How about you, Brian? Do you think it's going to last?
I hope so, but I guess the best I can say is I'm cautiously optimistic.
Okay. Well, I want to thank. Oh, go
I
ahead.
do want to say that on IMDb, my handle there is DDoc67 if anyone wants to comment or refute anything that I said. And I also have a website that's actually been idle for a few years, but if anyone wants to check it out, it's on YouTube under AltaDate27, the little cartoons.
Okay.
Those are awesome, by the way. I've seen those. My screen name on IMDb is BryAbba2.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank both Brian and Dave for joining me, and I'm mixed too. There's a part of me that looks at the show as like a senile old relative, and
Yes.
I just sort of like I want to put it out of its misery and sort of remember the good times. But on the other hand, I do enjoy it. But like I said, I've sort of been on autopilot myself. But anyone who enjoys soap operas and has enjoyed this show, go watch the DVD set of Dark Shadows or Doctor Who or any of these serial dramas because, as I mentioned, General Hospital isn't the only one. One of my favorite all-time ones, as I mentioned, was Prisoner Cell Block H about Australian women in prison, and it seems that it's probably in future generations going to be seen as mostly a 20th century phenomenon, starting on radio and then television. But who knows? Maybe in the 2020s, the PP episode will spark some company that can make it work. And who knows, in 2035, there will be soap operas online that I'm going to be too old to get involved in watching, but hopefully it will continue. Anyone who wants to enjoy this show, though, come back next week, and we'll be totally switching gears from the pop culture world to that of intellectuals. I'm going to be having my first interview debate with two intellectuals over the scientist Richard Dawkins and whether he's a visionary or a fraud, and that should hopefully ruffle a few feathers. So come back next week. And I want to thank Brian and Dave, and just keep listening. Thank you.